is invading our home. They are brutal, relentless, unstoppable. We are 80 samurai against an army, fighting to slow the invasion. Today, I die for my people.
There must be thousands of them. We will face death and defend our home.
Tradition, courage, honor. They are what make us. We are the warriors of Tsushima. We are samurai! Nodadachi, go break their spirits. Hey! Outsiders! Send your finest warrior to face me!
Nada, Jinnida.
I am Harunobu Adachi, descendant of the legendary Yoshinobu Adachi. Samurai! Do you surrender? Cowards without honor deserve no mercy. No mercy! Open fire! For Tsushima! Charge!
Welcome. This channel is about two things I hold dear: video games and history. On today's video, we will visit the recently released game Ghost of Tsushima for the PlayStation 4. As you may have watched my previous videos, I am a big fan of Japanese history, especially during the Sengoku era, where there were a lot of internal conflict and power struggle within Japan. However, the event in history this game takes place happened a few hundred years before the Sengoku era, 1274 AD to be exact. Japan in many ways was still in its infancy. The story begins in Tsushima, where around 80 samurai prepare to meet the Mongol invaders on the shores of Komoda. A bloody battle ensues, and every samurai but one survives the Mongol onslaught. This survivor is the protagonist of the game, Jin Sakai. Tradition and honor won't lead him to victory. Jin is forced to carve a new way of fighting, the way of the ghost, as he begins an unconventional war for the freedom of Tsushima. In my opinion, it is one of the best looking games in any platform I have ever seen. The realism in the environment, from the wind blowing the leaves, flowers and the grass, are unparalleled. I would say that most of the elements of 13th century Japan have been replicated in this game. One of the things I loved while playing this game is traveling all over Tsushima in horseback. There was a feeling of refreshment, relaxation, whenever I see the pampas dancing in the wind. Another aspect of the game I absolutely admired are the sword duels. As a kid, I was always fascinated with sword fights, particularly with Japanese ones, wherein one sword swing and the protagonist defeats his enemy. There had been a lot of samurai games that made a mark on me, but what separates Ghost of Tsushima, in my opinion, from those other games is that it doesn't involve magical weapons to overcome the enemy, no supernatural beings to aid you, just one man trying to take back an entire island using his skill of the katana. The Mongol invasions of Japan happened in two separate occasions. One on November 1274 and a second one on June 1281 AD. Kublai Khan, the ruler of the Mongol Empire, sent two immense fleets from Korea and China. In both instances, the Japanese, and especially the samurai warriors, valiantly defended their shores, but it would be the typhoon storms and the so-called kamikaze which led to the demise of a lot of Mongol ships and men, thus saving Japan from foreign conquest. The whole event, which mixed divine intervention with martial heroism, would later hold mythical status in Japanese culture forever. The Mongols had already sucked half of China and Korea into their vast empire, and their leader Kublai Khan now set his sights on Japan. Kublai was the grandson of Genghis Khan and had founded the Yuan dynasty of China, with his capital at Dadu. It is unknown why he wanted to conquer Japan, and one can only speculate he may have sought to conquer Japan for its resources. The country did have a long-standing reputation in East Asia as a land of gold. Kublai Khan may have wished to enhance his prestige or eliminate the trade between Japan and his great enemy in southern China, the Song dynasty. Conquering Japan would also incorporate a new and well-equipped army into the Khan's hands, which he could have used to good effect against the troublesome Song. The invasions may even be considered as some form of revenge for the menace that the Wako pirates had been causing to East Asian coastlines and trade ships. One thing was clear, however. Kublai's approach was diplomacy first, warfare second. The Great Khan sent a letter to Japan in 1268 AD, recognizing its leader as the King of Japan, and expressing a genuine desire to foster good relations, but at the same time demanding tribute be paid to the Mongol court, with the ominously veiled threat that the use of arms was, the Khan hoped, to be avoided. A Chinese ambassador, Zhao Liangbi, was also sent to Japan in 1270 AD. He stayed there for a year with the goal of fostering an understanding between the two nations. Further letters and ambassadors were sent by the Khan up to 1274 AD, but all were blatantly ignored. The Kamakura shogunate was the ruling party at that time, and the shogun Hojo Tokimune was confident he could deal with any threat from mainland Asia. Troops were put on alert in the Dazaifu fortress and military base in northwest Kyushu, where any invasion seemed most likely to land. But the Khan's diplomatic approach was rebuffed both by the Japanese emperor and the shogunate. Japan at that time were fairly new in terms of dealing with other nations diplomatically, as they were an isolated country for a long period of time. The Khan amassed a fleet of some 900 ships and dispatched it from Korea to Japan in early November 1274 AD. The ships carried an army of about 16,000 to 40,000 men, which consisted of Mongols and conscripted Chinese and Koreans. The first Japanese territory to receive these invaders was Tsushima and Iki Islands on the 5th and 13th of November, respectively. The Mongols' attack had met stiff resistance on Tsushima, where the defenders fought vigorously and were led by So Sukekuni, but to no avail due to the disadvantage of numbers compared to the Mongol invaders. The defensive force at Iki, led by Taira Kagetaka, was equally valiant, but met the same fate as their Tsushima counterparts when no reinforcements came from the mainland. The invading Mongol fleet landed on Hakata Bay on the 19th of November. The bay's shallow waters had suggested to the Japanese this would be the exact spot the invaders would land. Albeit they were prepared, the Japanese defense force was relatively small, between 4,000 and 6,000 men. The Mongols, with their superior numbers and sophisticated weapons, won the first engagements. The powerful double-horn bow and gunpowder grenades fired by catapults, and their more dynamic battlefield strategies using well-disciplined and skillful cavalry which responded to orders conveyed by gongs and drums. The Mongols had other effective weapons too, such as armor-piercing crossbow and poisoned arrows. To make matters worse for the Japanese, they were not used to combat involving mass troop movements, as they favored allowing individual warriors to pick their own single targets. Rather, the Japanese warriors operated in small groups led by a mounted samurai skilled at archery and a number of protective infantry armed with a naginata or curved blade pole arm. Another disadvantage was that the Japanese used shields only as protective walls for archers, while the Mongols and the Korean infantry typically carried a shield of their own as they moved around the battlefield. The samurai did have some things to their favor. One of them is having iron plate and leather armor, and their long sharp swords were used much more effectively than the Mongol short sword. Bizarrely, 18 days after first landing on Japanese soil, and despite creating a bridgehead at Hakata Bay, the Mongols did not push deeper into Japanese territory. One reason is because of supply problems, or another is the death of the Mongol general Liu Fuxiang, caused by a samurai's arrow. It may also be true that the whole invasion was actually just a reconnaissance mission for the second larger invasion yet to come, and no intention of conquest in 1274 AD. Whatever the motive, the invaders remained by their ships for the night, withdrawing out into the bay for safety on the 20th of November. This turned out to be a fatal decision because, in some accounts, a terrible storm then struck, which killed up to a third of the Mongol army and severely damaged the fleet. The attackers were forced to withdraw back to Korea. After the failed attempt of 1274, Kublai Khan once again resorted to diplomacy and sent another embassy to Japan in 1275 AD, demanding, once again, tribute be paid. This time, the shogunate was hostile in its reply and beheaded the Mongol ambassadors on a beach near Kamakura. The Khan, however, was unfazed and sent a second emissary in 1279 AD. The messengers met the same fate as their predecessors, and the Khan realized only force would bring Japan into the Mongol Empire. However, Kublai Khan was occupied with military campaigns against the Song, and it would be 2 more years before he turned his attention once again to Japan. Meanwhile, the Japanese had been expecting an inevitable invasion ever since the events of 1274, and this period of uncertainty cost a lot in terms of finances from the government. Apart from keeping the army on standby, fortifications were built and massive stone walls were erected around Hakata Bay in 1275 AD, which measured some 19 kilometers in length and were up to 9 feet high. Intended to permit archers on horses, the inner sides of the Hakata walls were sloped while the outer facing was sheer. If a second invasion was to come, Japan was now much more prepared for it. Kublai Khan's second attempt at invading Japan was a whole lot bigger than the first one. This time, thanks to his recent defeat of the Song and acquisition of their navy, there were 4,400 ships and around 100,000 men. Again, a mix of Mongol, Chinese, and Korean warriors. Once again, the invaders hit Tsushima on the 9th of June and Iki on the 14th of June, before attacking Hakata Bay on Kyushu on the 23rd of June, 1281 AD. This time, though, the force split and one fleet attacked Honshu, where it was rebuffed at Nagado. Meanwhile, at Hakata, the Japanese put their defenses to good use and presented a stiff resistance. The fortification walls did their job, and this time the attackers could not establish themselves permanently on the beach, resulting in much shipboard fighting. Eventually, after heavy losses, the Mongols withdraw first to Shiga and Noki Islands, and then to Iki Island. There, they were harassed by Japanese ships making constant raids into the Mongol fleet, using small boats and much courage. Many of the later stories of samurai heroics come from this episode of the invasion. The Khan then dispatched reinforcements from southern China, perhaps another 40,000 men, and the two armies gathered to make a combined push deeper into Japanese territory, this time selecting Hirado as the target in early August. The combined fleets then moved east and attacked Takashima, the battle there taking place on the 12th of August. Fierce fighting went on for several weeks, and the invaders likely faced shortages of supplies. Then, yet again, the weather intervened and caused havoc. On the 14th of August, a typhoon destroyed most of the Mongol fleet, wrecking ships that had been tied together for safety against Japanese raids and smashing the uncontrollable vessels against the coastline. From half to two-thirds of the Mongol force was killed. Thousands more of the Khan's men were washed up or left stranded on the beaches of Imari Bay, and these were summarily executed, although some Song Chinese, former allies of Japan, were spared. Those ships that survived sailed back to China. The storm winds that either sunk or blew the Mongol ships safely away from the Japanese shores were given the name kamikaze, or divine winds, as they were seen as a response to the Japanese appeal to Hachiman, the Shinto god of war, to send help to protect the country against a vastly numerically superior enemy. It seems, too, that the Mongol ships were not particularly well built and so proved much less seaworthy than they should have been. Modern marine archaeology has revealed that many of the ships had especially weak mast steps, which is something absolutely not to have in the case of a storm. The poor workmanship may have been due to Kublai Khan rushing to get the invasion fleet together, as many of the ships in the fleet were a variety without a keel and highly unsuitable for sea voyages. Further, Chinese ships of the period were actually renowned for their seaworthiness, so it seems the demand for a huge fleet in a short space of time resulted in a risk that did not pay off. Nevertheless, the crucial factor in the fleet's demise was the Japanese attacks, which had forced the Mongol commanders to have their large and unwieldy ships lashed together using chains. It was this defensive measure which proved fatal come the typhoon. The Mongols would also fail in their attempts to conquer Vietnam and Java, but after 1281 AD, they did then establish a lasting peace over most of Asia, which would endure until the rise of the Ming dynasty in 1368 AD. Kublai Khan never gave up on the diplomatic route either, and continued to send unsuccessful missions to persuade Japan to join the Chinese tribute system. The Japanese, meanwhile, may have seen off the two invasions, but they fully expected a third to come at any time, and so kept an army in constant readiness for the next 30 years. Fortunately for them, the Mongols had other challenges to face along the borders of their massive empire, and there would be no third time lucky in the attempt to conquer Japan. The Buddhist monks and Shinto priests, who had long been promising divine intervention, were proved right when the storms destroyed the Mongol fleets, and this resulted in an upsurge in both religions' popularity. One area of life where the invasions are curiously absent is in Japanese medieval literature, but there is one famous scroll painting depicting the invasion, commissioned by a samurai warrior who fought during the invasion, Takesaki Suenaga. It is known as the Mongol Scroll, or Mokoshurai e Kotoba, and was produced in 1293 AD to promote Takesaki's own role in the battle. Unfortunately for the Japanese government, though the practical costs of the invasions would have serious consequences, an army had to be kept in constant readiness. Hakata was kept on alert with a standing army until 1312 AD, and payment to soldiers became a serious problem, leading to widespread discontent. This was a war of defense, not conquest, and there were no spoils of war, like land, to reward the soldiers. The agricultural sector was also severely disrupted by the defense preparations. Rivals to the Hojo clan, who ruled the Kamakura shogunate, began to prepare their challenge to the political status quo. Emperor Go-Daigo, eager for the emperors to regain some of their long-lost political power, stirred up a rebellion which resulted in the eventual fall of the Kamakura shogunate in 1333 AD, and the beginning of the Ashikaga shogunate, with its first shogun, Ashikaga Takauji. Thank you for watching, and subscribe to my channel if you would like to see videos of this content.